Unless Season 8 of Game of Thrones has completely erased your memory, then you probably remember the Night's Watch. You know, the guys defending the giant ice wall against the wildlings, or in actuality, against the White Walkers. It used to be a post of honour, but over time, its prestige dwindled until it was only held by rejects and criminals. Well, what if I told you that Middle-earth had a version of the Night's Watch? Sort of. In this video, let's talk the Watch on Mordor. Now, before I continue, I just want to clarify. Yes, obviously the Watch on Mordor was written about long before the Night's Watch. So you could say that the Night's Watch is Westeros' Watch on Mordor instead. But the Watch on Mordor, while not exactly being obscure, is also not that well known, so the video title works better in reverse. And I'm also not insinuating that the Night's Watch was a copy or was inspired by the Watch on Mordor. They're similar, but not so much that it makes you wonder. So what was the Watch on Mordor? After Sauron was defeated during the War of the Last Alliance, the men of Gondor recognized that there was a problem. During the war, Sauron had issued forth from Mordor and seized Minas Ithil in a surprise attack, and had almost made it to Osgiliath before being driven back. Evidently, Gondor's heartland could be reached from Mordor in a matter of days, meaning that as long as an enemy occupied Mordor, then Gondor's primary cities would never truly be safe. Of course, Sauron was now defeated, so surely the threat had passed, right? Well, the main threat had, but Mordor was still a dangerous place. The fact that the Watch was established in the first place suggests that not all of Sauron's forces had been destroyed in the war, and perhaps in the hills and mountains of Mordor, orcs and other creatures remained in large enough numbers to pose a threat to Gondor. With the plateau of Gorgoroth being an inhospitable wasteland, Gondor couldn't simply occupy the territory either, so unable to fully cleanse Mordor or to properly occupy it, the Gondorians did the next best thing. They established a ring of forts to watch Mordor and to keep any enemies from leaving it. We don't know how many fortresses Gondor built, or how many soldiers they used to man them, but we do know a couple of them. Perhaps the most famous of these fortresses were Narcost and Carcost, the Towers of Teeth, which stood at either end of the Morannon, the Black Gate. The Black Gate itself was actually built by Sauron, but with the Towers of Teeth acting as the garrisons, the Black Gate was now manned by the forces of Gondor. Further to the south, inside Mordor itself, at the northern end of the road called the Morgai, was the fortress of Durthang. We don't actually know if Durthang was built by Gondor. Tolkien never definitively states that it was. However, given its Sindarin name, it's widely believed to have been built and manned by Gondorians. Even Christopher Tolkien believed this to be the case. As far as we know, Durthang was the Gondorian fortress that was the deepest in enemy territory, and it had to be supplied along the Morgai. And at the southern end of the Morgai, we have the Tower of Cirith Ungol. Positioned on a ridge high above the Morgai, this tower had two purposes: watch over the plains of Mordor and guard the pass of Cirith Ungol, which at the time was known as Cirith Dúath, possibly because Shelob had not yet made her home there. We're unsure when she moved in. This tower was arguably the most important fortress Gondor had in Mordor. From its vantage point, one could clearly see the movement of enemies in Mordor, and it acted as a first line of defense for the city of Minas Ithil. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about the early history of the Watch on Mordor. It's only actually mentioned for the first time in the reign of Atanatar II Alcuin, who ruled between 1149 and 1226. Here it's mentioned that the Watch on Mordor began to be neglected, amongst other things, as Atanatar II was notorious for being a lazy king, and he passed that trait down onto his two sons. But I would be hesitant to blame Atanatar alone. In the early years of Gondor, while the memory of Sauron and Mordor was still fresh, the Watch on Mordor was very likely considered of great importance. Due to Gondor having peace on its other frontiers, the Watch on Mordor was probably the only place many soldiers could gain experience and prestige. But this began to change as Gondor started fighting wars on both its eastern and southern frontiers. Suddenly, the Watch on Mordor probably found itself of lesser importance. Disorganized orcs inside Mordor is far less of a threat than organized armies of Easterlings and Haradrim, and for the individual soldier, the watch on Mordor becomes far less appealing. Why volunteer to serve in a dark, depressing wasteland fighting thanklessly against orcs, when you could have honour, glory and gold fighting alongside your king against the armies of the south and east? Sure, maybe Mordor might be safer, but you don't become a soldier if personal safety is your primary concern. This cultural shift probably saw the Watch on Mordor become something of a backwater station. The highly competent ship kings would have been able to forestall this decline along the bounds of Mordor. You don't want to serve at Cirith Ungol? Bad luck. Hiarmendikil is sending you and your entire unit there. No ifs, no buts. But when a Tanatar is king, suddenly the administration isn't so strict. The Watch on Mordor begins to decline due to a lack of volunteers or incompetence within the military, and no one can be bothered fixing it. For example, the garrison at Cirith Ungol might need 10 replacement soldiers, whether due to death, retirement or transfers, but it only gets 7. Before I continue, I'd like to bring up Shadow of Mordor. Yes, the game that is notoriously bad when it comes to the lore. But one thing I did like about the lore in that game is that the protagonist, Talion, was serving at the Black Gate because he was in exile. Let's just ignore the fact that when the game is set, the Gondorians no longer manned the gate. While there isn't any evidence in the text for this, I do like the idea that the Watch on Mordor may have become something of a punishment post. It would make sense. You can still serve Gondor, and you don't really have any other options. What are you gonna do? Strike out into Gorgoroth and make friends with orcs? I'm going to bring this up again later. Once again, the Watch on Mordor is not mentioned for a long time. It's probable that it continued to decline, not because of incompetence, but due to necessity. After the Kinstrife Civil War of 1432 to 1447, Gondor found itself more or less constantly at war with the Haradrim and the rebels in Umbar for the next 200 years. These wars even saw the Corsair rebels do the unthinkable, attacking Gondor's heartlands by raiding Peligir, killing King Menardil, who was unfortunate enough to be there at the time. Manpower probably couldn't be spared for the Watch when losses were mounting on the southern frontier. But it was not warfare that ended the Watch on Mordor, it was disease. If you've followed my channel for a long time, you would have heard of the Great Plague dozens of times by now, and I can't help that. It was one of the most important events of the Third Age. When the Great Plague ripped through Gondor in 1636, it seems to have killed as much as 30 to 40% of the population, including King Telemnar and all his children. And the situation was so dire that if Gondor had been invaded at that time, it would have fallen. Fortunately for Gondor, the Great Plague did not discriminate, and its enemies were also devastated. King Torondor inherited a severely weakened realm, and to ensure its safety, he needed to consolidate. Thus, he pulled back Gondor's outer garrisons. Tharbad was abandoned, along with the entirety of Enedwaith, and while the lands beyond the Anduin and in Harad weren't officially abandoned, Gondor lost de facto control over them for the time. Also abandoned was the Watch on Mordor. Rather ironically, it's likely that the Watch on Mordor was probably the safest place to be during the Great Plague. It was isolated from the rest of Gondor, and could have been more effectively quarantined should the need arise. This isn't actually the end of the Watch on Mordor though. Although the Watch was definitely stated as ceasing during the reign of Torondor, it seems to have been restarted, perhaps by Torondor himself later in his reign, or by one of his descendants. If it was a later king, we don't know which one, as all of Torondor's descendants were military-minded men, and it feels like any one of them could have been the one responsible. But we do know that when Ondahur marched to his death against the Wainriders in 1944, the Towers of Teeth are said to have still been manned by Gondorian soldiers. And the Watch even continued after that disaster. The Tower of Cirith Ungol was still manned in at least the year 1980, and possibly as late as the year of 2000. We know this because apparently the tower was yielded to the Witch King through treachery from within. The Witch King only returned to Mordor in 1980, and the siege of Minas Ithil began in 2000. The fact that the tower fell through treachery might explain how the Nazgul were able to swoop down upon Minas Ithil and surprise it, cutting it off from the rest of Gondor. Perhaps they had no warning. Also, it gives credence to the idea that the Watch may have been manned by less than savoury individuals, perhaps criminals or exiles. After all, would a good person do a deal with the Witch King? Regardless of what happened, the Watch definitely seems to have ceased by the year of 2000, whether through abandonment or through falling to the newly reorganised forces of Mordor led by the Nazgul. The failure of the Watch meant that the Nazgul were able to capture Minas Ithil and turn it into Minas Morgul, which would be a source of woe to Gondor for the millennia to come. As for the fortresses that Gondor left behind, the Orcs accepted them willingly, and places like the Towers of Teeth, Cirith Ungol, and Durthang became fortresses of evil. In particular, Cirith Ungol would come oh so close to being the doom of the Free Peoples when Frodo was captured. Luckily, Sam would make sure the important trinket he carried would not fall into enemy hands. So could things have been different if the Watch was maintained? Absolutely. Although it's unlikely that Gondor would have been able to contain Mordor forever, delay or stronger resistance might have meant that Minas Ithil might not have fallen when it did. Gondor holding the pass there would have made it far more difficult for the forces of Mordor to break out into Ithilien, ravaging one of Gondor's heartland provinces. Perhaps the entire history of the late Third Age would have been completely different. But the real question is, could the Watch have been maintained to a proper degree? Well, to be fair to the Gondorians, probably not, at least when you're operating from the knowledge you have at the time. Mordor had been dormant for years, and with the enemies of Gondor on the march in both the east and south, you can see why the Watch became less important as the age dragged on. Soldiers were urgently needed fighting the Easterlings, the Corsairs, the Haradrim. Surely the Watch could do without a few soldiers here and there. You can understand why Mordor might have slipped out of the minds of the Gondorians. But the Great Plague made all that meaningless anyway. It made sense for Torondor to pull back his outer garrisons. What good would watching Mordor have done if Gondor was too weak to defend its own heartland? Torondor may not have known at the time that Gondor's enemies had also suffered grievously and would be incapable of launching attacks. He didn't know that withdrawing from Mordor was ultimately needless. And when the Watch was finally overwhelmed during the reign of King Eärnil II, Gondor had just emerged from over a century of warfare with the Wainriders and had also dealt with Angmar. After Mordor had been quiet for 2,000 years, it might have seemed like it would continue that way for the foreseeable future, especially after so many enemies had just been recently vanquished. We can't exactly blame him for not knowing that it was about to change, that the Witch King and the Nazgul were on their way to Mordor just as he was kicking his feet up for a well-deserved rest. But even if he did expect something might happen in Mordor, would he have even had the men to stop it? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe if Cirith Ungol wasn't betrayed from within, everything might have been fine. Maybe that nameless traitor played a bigger part in the history of Middle-earth than we might realise. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. There's something alluring about the whole concept of guardians of humanity, selfless defenders on the walls, guarding against some horrible threat that ensure the people behind them can sleep safe at night, which is why I like the Night's Watch and the Watch on Mordor so much. The Roman legions on the Danube and the Rhine were kind of like this too, in between choosing their own emperors and starting pointless civil wars all the time. Anyway, cheers, farewell, and remember, if you want to feel like you're part of the Watch on Mordor, go stand at the beach and wait. The crab people will emerge any day now, and you'll be there, sword in hand, ready to meet them.